we begin tonight with that major breaking news on Boeing. Sources telling CNBC just moments ago the company will halt production on the grounded 737 MAX airplane beginning next month. Boeing stock moving lower all session and moving lower in the after hours. Let's get more now on this major development as it's happening. Phil LeBeau live in Chicago with more. Phil.
Brian, this is a decision to halt production that was reached by the board of directors from Boeing, who met yesterday and today here in Chicago. And we've been hearing from people familiar with the discussions that the board was leaning towards halting production as opposed to slowing it down. It's currently at 42 per month. That's how many 737 MAXs they build. It's been at that rate since back in April. Remember, it was grounded in March. And what the company has decided is, look, at some point, when you have more than 400 built but not yet delivered 737 MAXs, it makes more sense to shut down the line until the grounding is lifted. The workers who are out at that plant in Renton, Washington, about 12,000 of them, they will not be furloughed. They will be redeployed either to other Boeing plants or other projects within the company, but they will not be laid off. They will continue to be paid. The question now is, how long does this go? How long will they shut down the line? And nobody's quite sure. The trigger for bringing the line back up will be when the FAA is close to or says, look, we're going to lift the grounding here. And most believe that's likely to happen maybe early February, maybe mid-February. So do the math. You're looking at a production halt that could likely last anywhere from 45 to 60 days. But again, that's just an estimate at this point. If there are further delays, if the FAA says we're not ready and it gets pushed out further into March or even April, then you could see this halt in production last even longer. But again, Boeing has decided that it will be halting 737 MAX production. Brian, I can't remember the last time this company has ever done this on their own. Now, there have been work stoppages because of Machinists strike. There was one back in 2008. But I can't remember Boeing voluntarily saying, we've got to shut down the line. This is unprecedented.
Yeah, it really is. A couple quick questions, Phil. What do you know about the order book for the 737 MAX? I mean, how many airlines over how many years? Right. I know it's a pretty deep book. And also, what about, speaking of machinists, any layoffs planned?
Right. Again, no layoffs. They're not going to be furloughed, any of those workers. Now, what happens with some of the suppliers? Boeing is going to be working with their key suppliers. Spirit Aerosystems is a good example out of Wichita, Kansas. They build the fuselages for the 737 MAX. They're going to try to work with those suppliers so that they do not have to lay off or furlough any of their workers. And they want to continue as much as possible to continue to see that those companies continue to supply Boeing with the key components there. And in terms of what this means for the bottom line, look, they've got 4,400 MAXs that have been ordered. That backlog has not changed. And as long as that backlog is there, that's the support for the stock. Yes, it's down, 323, and we've seen it go as low as 320 a few months ago, but that's the support that's there. People are saying, well, eventually, unless they completely scrap this plane, and nobody's expecting that to happen, they're going to build these planes, they're going to deliver these planes. And that backlog, by the way, Brian, extends out 7, 8 years, something like that, depending on what the monthly production rate is.
You know, Phil, you talked about Spirit Aerosystems. I mean, there are probably hundreds, if not thousands, of suppliers inside of every plane. You look down at the industry that I cover, oil and gas, it's slowing down. You wonder if this MAX production halt could have a ripple effect on almost the entire American economy.
Well, it certainly will have a ripple effect up in the Puget Sound area, the Pacific Northwest. But the fact that the workers will not be furloughed at the Renton plant, that Boeing will continue to pay them, I mean, that's going to soften the blow a bit. But you don't know what happens with the 600 or so suppliers who are out there. Boeing is going to work with them because Boeing is worried that, look, when we fire up this production line again and then ramp up production later in 2020, then in 2021, they want to make sure that the suppliers can meet that demand. So they don't want to see the suppliers turn around and say, you know what, we're cutting 20% of our staff. That's not what they want. So this is the tricky balancing act that Boeing is going to have to work through with its key suppliers.
All right, Phil LeBeau, a big breaking story there on Boeing. Phil, appreciate that. All right. Shares of Boeing getting close to erasing all their gains for the year. Tim Seymour, 320. A lot of people saying that's kind of a technical line in the sand. They need the stock to stop there, down 4%, down another percent in the after hours. Your take on Boeing?
Well, for people that want to see good news, I'm one of them. I'm long the stock. But I think there's a couple things that you could have anticipated this news. First of all, they raised almost $10 billion earlier in the year to offset the free cash flow impact. I mean, they've gone from being a free cash flow machine to actually seeing it dry up. They took a $5.6 billion charge in the second quarter against, again, building. I think they're going to have closer to 500 on inventory by the time we get to the end of this year. So I think this is not a great day for the company, but I think it's important that they're being very proactive. This is as much of a political move as this is an industrial move.
They're getting in front of something that you can argue that should have gotten in front of maybe months ago. It doesn't matter. I mean, that's somewhat moot now. But in terms of the levels, you brought it up. I mean, 320 and change was the low we saw in the middle of August. That's where we probably are as we speak right now. We've said for a while that this stock will continue to vacillate between sort of that 325 level and the 375 level. And if you go back on November 26th, traded 375, we were sitting on the desk saying now's the time to pull the ripcord and take profits. The good news is today the stock traded about 4 times normal volume, typically trades about 4 million shares, traded about 16 million today. That's a good sign. A lot of people getting flushed out. The concern is the tape at some point works against you, and this is not the last headline. Your real level, if you want to get into the weeds here, is that last December, so a year ago, when the stock traded down to 298, if you recall. That's your ultimate support. But I think there should be decent support right at this 320 level.
It's interesting, though, Karen, because if you look at the 2-year chart, and it's not exactly perfect, but you've basically made no money in the stock over 2 years. That is before the 730 MAX tragic accidents, the 2 occurred.
Right.
Boeing hadn't been exactly a rocketing stock for the better part of a year before this occurred.
Well, but the prior year it had.
Sure, it had for a long time, and then it kind of stalled out.
They just put out that official statement right now that they actually are suspending production, and they talk about the reasons why, being uncertain about timing of going into service. One of also including the timing for training. So I don't know if there's anything to be inferred here about whether they actually think the timing might be put off even a little bit further. But I don't know. This maybe it opens just a tiny crack. I know Phil said nobody's talking about it, but a tiny crack. What if the 737
gets scuttled?
Yes.
Well, we've talked about that. We've talked about the possibility, and everyone says that's never going to happen. This plane will hit the skies again, and it will fly again. But you wonder, what if? There's no guarantees in anything.
No, never. But I think it is generally good news that we held that technical level, at least in the short term. But in terms of jumping right in, the trend line is basically flat. So I would look for a more clear change in that before moving more aggressively into the stock. But this isn't going to threaten the nature of the company. I think the balance sheet is still okay. Once they start to deliver those planes that have already been built, you see better cash flow positions likely. But I think the supply chain story is really interesting. If you look at a company like Spirit Aerosystems as an example, they've been producing fuselages at a higher rate than actually full planes are being produced. So with this shutdown, they need to cut back on production, and their stock has held up a lot better than Boeing itself. So you could see actually more room to the downside there versus actually Boeing itself.
I think we have Phil. Phil, are you still there? Yeah, I want to bring you back in, Phil, because let's talk about, it's really I understand there's some smaller players, a duopoly in sort of large-scale airplane manufacturing. Have you talked to anybody that suggests there might be a reputational risk for Boeing? Forget about the planes that are currently ordered and under production.
Future models.
Going forward, Delta, United, Southwest, who's got a lot of MAXs, and I know they only fly the 737. Is there any risk they say Boeing they kind of screwed us over on this one? We got a lot of bad information for the company. We need to take a look at Airbus.
Yes, that is definitely out there. And I have heard that from people in the airline industry. Now, at the same time, they go into this understanding that there's only so far you can go with a duopoly, that if you went to Airbus, how much of a incentive could you get to become, let's say if you were Southwest, to also start ordering Airbus planes? On the A320 side, not a whole lot. They might get some incentive if you're somebody like a Southwest, but maybe with the smaller plane like an A220. But there's definitely a reputational risk, Brian, no doubt at all. Look, you can already see it when you take a look at what's going on with the A321 XLR, which is the long-range plane that Airbus introduced this summer. Well, Boeing was supposed to have something counter to that introduced this summer at the Paris Air Show. there was no introduction. Clearly, Boeing is focused on the MAX. So what's happened since then? The XLR has racked up order after order after order. We just had one from United about a week and a half ago. That's United saying we're going to place 50. 50, that's the order we put with Airbus. So there is a reputational risk for Boeing. They are well aware of it, and it's not something that is just idle chatter amongst people. You do hear about it in the airline industry.
All right, I know there's also some other breaking news right now happening on Boeing. Sort of as you're sitting there answering that question, Phil, more news is coming on this big story. What else is happening right now with BA?
Well, the latest, if you're referring to them making the official announcement, is that what you're referring to, Brian?
Yeah, and I know you probably haven't had time to dive in because you broke the story,
Yeah.
But now the announcement, I wonder if there's anything new in that.
It's what's interesting is it's pretty much what we have been hearing about for the last couple of days that is likely. They said, look, we have previously stated that we will continually evaluate our production plans should the MAX grounding continue longer than we expected. As a result of this ongoing evaluation, we have decided to prioritize the delivery of stored aircraft and temporarily suspend production on the 737 program beginning next month. We believe this decision is least disruptive to maintaining long-term production system and supply chain health. This decision is driven by a number of factors, including the extension of certification into 2020, the uncertainty about the timing and conditions of return to service and global training approvals, and the importance of ensuring that we can prioritize the delivery of stored aircraft. We will continue to assess, and I think there's one last part of the statement here, our progress towards return to service milestones and make determinations about resuming production and deliveries accordingly. That, Brian, that's a nice way of saying we're not sure when this is going to be lifted, when this plane will be approved by the FAA, and therefore we're not sure when we will resume production of the 737 MAX. Again, what I'm hearing from people is expect 45 to 60 days, but that's purely a guess. It could be shorter, it could be longer. It all depends on what the FAA says with this plane.
Hey, Phil, curious how much of this is really the politics around there were some that said the FAA was not happy with the guidance that Boeing was giving to the market. Do you think that's what this is? And only that?
Absolutely, they weren't happy. There's no politics there.
Okay.
The FAA has been frustrated on so many fronts when it comes to this process with Boeing. And when Boeing put out the guidance on November 11th saying, we expect certification by the end of the year and possibly some commercial service for some airlines when they take delivery by the end of January, they went nuts. They went nuts because they were like, wait a second, there's a whole bunch of things that still need to happen. And there's some public comment periods that are built into some of these steps. I mean, it was from the beginning. And you saw that almost immediately from the FAA. They came out and they said, oh, no. No. You are not going to be the ones telling us what's going on. And it continued, and they would not bring back that guidance. And that's when you finally saw Steve Dickson meeting with Dennis Muilenburg in Washington last week after Dickson was on the Hill. That's when he said to him, knock it off, because we're not ready to approve this. And by the way, they've got about 10 or 11 steps they still need to go through. And there are public comment periods in there. He's not short-circuiting this process.
Phil LeBeau, a lot of breaking news there on a major important story. In fact, probably the most important stock in America because of its heavy price weighting inside the Dow. Phil, thank you very much.
You bet.
All right, Karen, start with this. Dennis Muilenburg, Phil, the CEO, lost his chairmanship.
Right. No.
Does he deserve to lose his job as CEO?
Deserve? I'm not sure.
Should he lose his job as CEO?
Could it happen? You could see it happen.
Well, are you implying that there's a fresh thing that's gone wrong, which is the communication factor, which hasn't been handled?
I'm talking about the disconnect between the initial reports, 9 weeks, and the FAA, 9 months, and the lack of communication. I'm just wondering how a CEO who is arguably doesn't have all the information, but should have more than anybody else, has made such apparently tactical errors.
Karen.
Right. I don't know. I mean, certainly it puts more pressure on them. This is surprising to me, the actual suspension of production. I mean, because it just opens such a can of worms in terms of their supply chain and what could happen to them. And then if they want to revamp and, get going again, is that supply chain still able to do that? And are the customers still there? How much can you sell that plane for? Even if they do, how much do you owe now in continued delay? How much do you owe the airlines that have already ordered them? I don't know. I think, God, it's a lot of pressure on him. I think that was a serious misstep, though, to confidently convey that we think they'll be flying in the first quarter.
Well, I think in terms, too, about thinking about the stock in Muilenburg and how to trade around that, it's really difficult to buy or sell based on sort of that binary outcome, in or out. You have to guess whether he's going to be in or out. You have to guess that correctly, and then you have to guess whether the market's going to like it or not. And so I think it's very difficult to try to trade around that and make a decision solely on whether the CEO is in or out. I think you have to look at other things.
Would it be beneficial for the stock if there was a new CEO at the helm at this time? Or is
I don't know.
Or is it such a complicated issue that you've got to get through it before you made any changes?
The CEO oversaw a re-rating of this company of massive proportions. Let's just be clear about that. But I hear what you're all saying, and I would also say, we talked a little bit about the leverage on the balance sheet, and in the short term, not a big deal. But, they went from 0.4 net leverage to 2.1 net leverage from 2018 till the last quarter. It can move very quickly when you're just building inventory and you're not sending planes out there.
All right, we'll get you more on Boeing. Boeing falling 4% in the current session, over 1% in the after hours. Well, I'm sure we'll have much more on Boeing going forward. All right.